Hello, Engineering Space Cadet. So today we're going to go over methods. Now, for those who are coming from a different language, a method in Python is the same as a function. But those who don't know methods or functions, this is going to be a very enlightening video for something that is commonly used within Python, or mostly used for mostly every single code base that you'll run into. So a method could be defined as a way of taking some complex code and abstracting it into a very simple call that you can use repeatedly within your system. But that sounds very technical, a little bit harder to understand. So let me show you an example of what I mean. Let's say, for example, I want to add two numbers together. I'll print 1 plus 2, right? Or let's say, for example, some other numbers. Print 3 plus 5, or print out 5 plus 6. And you can see that when I run this code, it prints out what I'm expecting. 3, 8, 11. Which is fine. However, one of the biggest problems that you run into is if you need to do this thing repeatedly. If I want to add a bunch of different numbers, I'd have to continually rewrite print 1 plus 2 or print some number plus some other number instead of just having an easy call, which I could just use repeatedly to add two numbers together. It's a very simple task, but it's a bit tedious. I'm using the same add function between all of these. Wouldn't it be better if I just had something to call in where I could just put a tiny bit of code and then add those two numbers to that tiny bit of code and print out what I'm expecting? So that's where methods come in. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, Python has its own built-in methods. These methods allow you to do other things. So when I was going over different data types, there was the float, right? The float and the integer. And I wrap these things and I can get a different result where I get a 0.0 because it's a float type. And if I wanted to return some string for the other integers, instead of returning it as string, I can return it as string. It doesn't look like string here, but if I was to wrap this in one other method called type, when I print this out, it'll print out that the type of string is string. So these are just different methods, and you can see me wrapping a bit of the code and more code, and it's like, okay, so what do these methods do? What do they mean? As I've explained before, they're just simple ways of simplifying some complex code into something that is usable for a user who maybe doesn't need to know the complex bits of it. A lot of times when it comes to using other people's code bases, or you get into a team where they have code that's already written, they'll write a lot of methods for you, or maybe you have to create your own methods to solve a particular problem. In this case, our problem is adding two numbers together. So we can add, and we can put two numbers, let's say, for example, x and y as placeholders. And ideally, when we hit this print, we can add two numbers together. So if I was to put 10 and 20 in here in this add method, it would add this up and it would give me 30. Right now, this is not going to run because add doesn't have anything inside of it. Add is not defined and it has no information inside of it. So what we could do is we could define this method. Defining is just telling the system, hey, I want this to be something that I can call into other functions, or I want this to be something that I can use repeatedly. So in order to end off this add, we're going to use this colon, and this colon just says whatever I do after this, when it's indented underneath it, this is what I want you to do. And in this case, we're going to return x plus y. So when we run this code and we put 10 and 20 here, as you can see, it now is replaced with the placeholders x and y. This should return 30. And as you see down here, it does return 30. Now we could do this with a bunch of different methods, but there are some things that you may not expect when it comes to these methods. Now, right now, these placeholders are x and y. So What happens if we pass in something that we get as an input? So let's say, for example, our number 1 is equal to input num1, which is just going to be wrapped in this input method. And we're just going to control X and then here control V. And let's say, for example, we're going to copy this as well, control C, and then control V, and we're going to call this num2, and we're going to say input num2. What happens if we take this string, because this input method will handle as a string, and we input num1, or num1 here, and num2 here? When we run this, we're going to add num1, which we're going to put in any number 1 that we want, which is 10, and num2 could be 20, and you can see that it's 10, 20. Because instead of adding these two numbers together, it concatenates them together. And that's just one of the aspects of a string. String will take string, it can add other string to it. We can actually multiply string, we can do a bunch of stuff with string, but it'll still inherently be string. So what essentially we'd want to do is restrict our input to give us a particular output. So we're going to wrap this in an int and wrap this also in an int. And this allows us to pass in any input string or any numbers into X and Y, and it will come out as the combination of two integers. So if we put 10 here and we put a 10 here, we'll get 20. Now if we try to run something else, like I put a word in here as a string, so string 10 as the input for some reason, and then string 20, you should see some very interesting behavior, right? The reason why is because the input only handles string to come in. So if I put a string of string, it just goes, I don't know how to handle that. So that's very interesting behavior because we're enforcing this integer and it'll tell you, hey, it's an invalid literal with base 10. So instead of it being a number of base 10, we put a string of base 10, which is something it can't handle. So it's just to let you know that there are certain methods that are very restricted in their application, and there are different ways to kind of avoid that and return different things, be like, hey, this is not valid. And right here you see this error, which you see this traceback and this value error. We'll talk about errors when it comes to exception handling, but for now, this is just a way to create a single method that will do something repeatedly. So now we could expand this. So let's say, for example, we take this, Control X, Control V, let's see, here, and Control V, and we just want to change this method to be a subtract method, right? And we can just change this operator to minus. So then we have two options where we can take this code and we can paste this code here, and we can just rename the method to sub, right? And then we can just take in two numbers like 10 and 10. And you can see it'll add those 10 and 10, it'll subtract those 10 and 10. That's the ease and simplicity of methods. They are ways to kind of abstract complicated information into something that I didn't really have to worry about. So you can see if later I wanted to call them the same method, I could use add or subtract and take these two placeholder values of X and Y and then put them in here. Now, there's different things when it comes to methods, such as positional arguments and then other kind of arguments that you're just passing in. So like you have positional arguments where it needs them to be passed in a very particular way. And then there's other ways where you can specify what that parameter you're trying to pass in is so that it always handles it as you're expecting it to. So right now, if I was to take the subtract and I put this number as a, for num1 is 10 and then num2 is negative 20, you can see it comes out as negative 10, and then the subtract would come out as 30. You wouldn't think that the subtract method would come out as 30. That would be kind of flawed, right? And it's because of the way we're passing it in. We're expecting num1 to be num1 in this particular way, and we can just switch these around if we wanted to, so that we can always enforce a certain behavior. And yeah, so there's a lot of different things you can do with these methods. Now we could make an entire video about different methods you can write, different ways you can write the methods, type hints, returns, and exception handling, and all this other stuff. But that is going to be for a different video. For now, this is just the basics of methods, and I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.